Hello and welcome to the January 21st edition of the Bub Report. As Grenada inches closer towards celebrating its 50th anniversary of nationhood, we sit with a panel of two citizens who are involved in this year's celebrations. The theme of the year-long series of events is One People, One Journey, and One Future. This week, we will reflect on notions of national unity and nationhood with two members of the Subcommittee on History, Identity, Heritage, and Documentation. Later on our program, we sit with a panel of experts who will discuss why a class action lawsuit was brought against the Canadian government by two migrant farm laborers from Grenada and Jamaica respectively. Both men were employed on Canadian farms over the last 15 years. The $500 million lawsuit seeks to expose the history of racial injustice against migrant workers in Canada. According to the Toronto Star, the case deals specifically with farm workers and alleges that the reasoning used to justify their employment is fundamentally racist. The conditions of migrant farm worker employment through Canada's Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program tie migrants to a specific employer, unlike an open permit which authorizes people to seek work elsewhere.
If they say something, they will no longer be requested for the next season.
The lawsuit utilizes historical records to argue that employer-specific work permits were imposed on Black and Indo-Caribbean farm laborers because of their race, and that it was motivated by overly racist policy objectives. We welcome our guests, Gloria Payne Banfield, retired public servant and former diplomat, Dr. Wendy Grenada, professor, author and chair of the Subcommittee on History, Identity, Heritage and Documentation for Grenada's 50th Independence Anniversary celebrations, Louis Century, civil litigation attorney, Chris Ramsaroop of the Migrant Workers Collective of Canada, and Saeed Hussain, Executive Director of Migrant Workers for Change. This week's editorial remembers the late Clyde Belfon. A pleasant good morning to our viewers and listeners, and we welcome you to this week's edition of the Bub Report. Now, last week, or at least in the last 2 weeks, we learned of the sad news of the passing of Mr. Clyde Belfon. He was a former lecturer, a retired lecturer at the T.A. Marichaud Community College, at the Teachers Education Department, to be more specific. Although I did not have the opportunity to sit at the feet of Clyde Belfon as a professor, I did interact with Mr. Belfon while I was a student at the T.A. Marichaud Community College. In fact, Mr. Belfon was a guest speaker in one of my communications classes that I took there at the college. And so in remembrance of the late Clyde Belfon, I will now recite one of his poems from back in 2003. The title of that poem is I'll Be Damned. And here goes. The people were so conveniently blind that they refused to see the extreme level of corruption taking place under their noses in this country. But I'll be damned if I again allow undereducated, lazy, do-nothing, Harry, Kickback, Jenny, and Gimme Joe to kill, eat, and eat the fatted cow. I said I'll be damned if again I am prone to intellectual abuse, terrorism, and fear. Be quiet or else be like one of them clowns in the movie Home Alone. I'll be damned if again I agree to be underpaid, overworked, and oppressed, ignored but monitored, denied and demoted by the powers that be. They reveled in debauchery, every procurement, all ill-gotten gain, popinjays and miscreants. What a sorry lot, totally oblivious of a country's pain. But Jonah is overboard, a different dispensation in train. Show me you care, folks. A new day has dawned. Honesty and trust, long awaiting hope. So I'll be damned if I can't shout, never again. Clyde Belfon, may your soul rest in peace, and may your memory be a blessing. And at this time, I wish to welcome our first two guests for this week's installment of the Bub Report. I am joined by Dr. Wendy Grenade, who is a political scientist and a member of one of the subcommittees of Grenada's 50th anniversary of independence, as well as Mrs. Gloria Payne Banfield. Mrs. Gloria Payne Banfield, who was, of course, around during the first iteration of Grenada's nationhood. In fact, Gloria Payne Banfield is one of the surviving citizens who actually witnessed Grenada accomplish independence back in 1974. Ladies, welcome to this week's installment of our Bub Report.
Good morning and welcome. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Mrs. Payne Banfield, it's also good to have you again. It's always a pleasure having you here on the program. We can hear you. I believe you're on mute. We can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, listeners and viewers. I'm very happy to be on the Bob Report again.
Absolutely. How does it feel? We are in independence mode. How are you feeling, Mrs. Payne Banfield?
I am watching and listening and trying to get myself enthusiastic about going up.
Yes. Absolutely. Now I want to begin by talking about the theme of this year's independence celebration. And of course, this year's theme speaks to a sense of oneness. The theme of this year's celebration is one people, one journey, one future. Now, in the context of Grenada as a state, as still a growing nation state, notions of national unity, and notion of oneness. To me, that continues to be a goal. Dr. Grenada, I begin with you. And first of all, telling us about the role of your subcommittee in respect of history and documentation, as well as to historicize this particular theme against the backdrop of challenges that Grenada has had over the last years around national unity.
Well, thank you very much, Kelon, and good morning again to you and to listeners and viewers. Before I begin, I want to, in my capacity as chair of the T.M. Marisha Community College, acknowledge the immense contribution that Mr. Clyde Belfon made to education and culture, and specifically to teacher education at MCC. May he rest in peace, and may his family be comforted, and may his contribution be remembered. Now, thanks for having us on this program. The subcommittee on history, identity, heritage, and documentation, of which Mrs. Payne Banfield and I are members. The other members are Dr. Oliver Benoit, Dr. John Angus Martin, Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, Miss Janice Martin, Mr. Chris DeRiggs. Dr. Wendy Crawford sits in with us as a sort of link between our subcommittee and the national committee. Hope I haven't left anyone out. Now, in that committee, we have two working groups, a working group on education and one on heritage, history, and documentation. For the last couple of months, we've been meeting and planning, and what we're doing now is sort of rolling out some of our plans. And I think later on, I hope you give me the chance to speak about some of the upcoming activities that we'll be having. But I want to address, Kelon, what you ask in terms of the challenges of national unity in the context of Grenada's founding as an independent state in 1974. Because what becomes important for me as a starting point, the Grenadian nation predated the Grenadian state that was established on the 7th of February 1974. So even as we think about independence, we cannot begin on February 7th, 1974. What was that Grenadian nation? Of course, it was a combination of histories, experiences, cultures, identities, indigenous people, the contestation for Grenada by Europeans, the whole question of noble enslaved Africans, Indians as indentured servants. So nationhood, Kelon, was shaped through a confluence of both internal and external forces. There was a class-based society. There was a very economically dependent, the economy was about economic dependence. It was a divided polity. So in the contestation for the nation, there was a cycle of conflict and resistance. But Kelon, by the early 1970s, the nation was not only divided by class and ethnicity, but there was a growing ideological divide. And this is where, when we stood in 1973-74, you had the conflict between Gary and the NGM and the anti-Gary forces. But what I want to insert in the conversation, because we like to begin by saying that, you know, the flag was hoisted in darkness and there was a lot of turbulence in the 1970s and independence started out of conflict. And that is true. But despite the contestation, something beautiful was happening to the Grenadian nation over time. A unique Grenadian identity was being formed, a common thread in our tapestry of diversity. There was a common thread. And the story of Grenada was not just a story of conflict, authoritarianism, and resistance. There was a rich, rich culture, Kelon, to include our language. And I'm reading again the book by Anthony de Riggs, We Kinda Talk, a Grenadian word salad, because a rich language emerged. That rich culture included religion and the spiritual resilience that grounded the nation. So we were in 1973, but we bring in something to the state. The nation is meeting the state. Our culture included folklore and myths and music and oral histories and our food. There was something distinctly Grenadian. So how had our history prepared us when we stood at that critical crossroad in 1973? And we know about the turbulence of the 1970s. We know about the strikes and the lockdowns. What had prepared us for 1973-74? We were seasoned from struggle that resulted in a particular type of Grenadian, a particular type of Caribbean person. And we must be reminded as we celebrate independence that we came from a tradition of overcoming. So we got to independence coming from a tradition of overcoming. We came from a tradition where there was a sense of community. Our Grenadianness was characterized by our strong family bonds, by our community networks, the schools we went to and the friends we made. And there was social capital, bridging and bonding capital. And we miss that when we ask how we became so conflictual as a society. There was a coexistence of unity and diversity. We shared common values because even as the politics was raging and the conflicts were going on, a village was raising a child. So while political pushed us and pulled us apart, there was a survival instinct and a sense of community that connected the collective Grenadian spirit. And if we celebrate nothing else, Kelon, we have to celebrate that collective Grenadian spirit. So there was a common Grenadian identity that predated independence, despite conflict. Now at independence, the nation, with its unity and diversity, had to coexist with a new sovereign state. That was what was happening in 1973. The nation, with all its baggage, with all its contradictions, with all its possibilities, now had to become a sovereign state. And statehood meant adding common symbols. And Sister Gloria speaks of this all the time. We added common symbols to nationhood: the flag, the anthem, the motto, the coat of arms, and importantly, a constitution. But I would say as I end that symbols and sovereignty do not mean unity becomes automatic. And I know we speak a little later on about this oneness. The challenge is to find societal cohesion in the midst of contestation, because contestation for the state, constant contestation for the nation continued even after 1973-74. So I think what I try to say in summary is that, yes, coming towards independence, it was conflict, the Gary and the anti-Gary forces, but we were bringing something to independence, a nation, unity in diversity, ruptured but standing. And I think that's what the message I would want to begin with.
Okay, thank you for that. It appears as though my audio was distorted. That is a challenge of sometimes. Is my audio better now, Dr. Grenade? Can you hear me better now? I just
much better. Much better.
Very well. All right. I do apologize for that. I try to produce a technically sound program, but sometimes this happens. I do apologize again. So let me bring in Mrs. Payne Banfield. Mrs. Payne Banfield, welcome again. Now, Grenada's road to independence, in the way that Dr. Grenade historicizes it here, she put it in that proper context. But I want to go back to February 1974. Now, those opposed to Sir Eric Matthew Gary they had no issues with, in fact, winning independence from our colonial oppressors, the British. But they had an issue with independence under the leadership of Sir Eric Matthew Gary. Now, in the context of national unity, talk about those divisions that existed back then as sort of the breeding ground for the challenges that we have in respect of national unity today.
Okay, thank you, Kellen, for inviting me to participate in this program. I want to tell you that I think that our road started a long way back. Mm-hmm. Not in 1973 with the protests and the drive for independence. It started perhaps with the breakup of the Federation and the challenges that presented, I think, were very real, in the sense that in 1962, when Jamaica voted to opt out of the Federation, and Eric Williams had his 1 from 10, what you call theorem, or whatever he called it, 1 from 10 is not,
1 from 10
9.
leaves not, yes.
It seems as if those external challenges forced us to start thinking independence. Because Jamaica went in 62, also Trinidad and Tobago later on in 62. Barbados went in 66, I think. And on they were going till we boiled down to little 8. And then it became little 7. And so I think that those circumstances pushed us, without even thinking, I think, into the whole business of saying, well, we're going to have to go it alone. So the thinking of a Grenada alone started festering, if you could call it festering, after the departure of the 2 big ones, or the 3 big ones, if you would say that Barbados was a big one. The anti-independence protests, as I think Wendy said it earlier, was not against independence really. It was it was about independence under Gary. People could not see themselves being called an independent country when you had a ruler who was reacting, I think, to everything that was going on around us in the Caribbean. And I think what Gary was really reacting to was the Black Power movement that festered and manifested itself in Trinidad. And after that, it is the adage, the old folk adage, when your neighbor house on fire, wet yours. So Gary started wetting his house. And of course,
But
history.
you talk about wetting his house. But wasn't there a heavy-handed manner in which he wet his house? So much so that while he was attempting to quell the Black Power movement in Grenada, which, by the way, was a progressive movement. I may be injecting my scholarly bias here, forgive me, but which resulted in a revolution back in 4 years later in 1979. Your thoughts?
Well, you see, the point is that you may consider the Black Power movement a progressive movement, and so do I.
Yes.
Because I think that everybody, every nation that is connected with the African heritage would consider this very progressive. The fact remains is that it threatened the status quo of people like Gary, because he himself was an advocate of Black Power in a different kind of way in 1951. And so the problem is that, it's a funny thing that you start to see yourself now as the victim. And he was seeing himself as the victim. And with Trinidad so near to us, he felt that Grenada had to be insulated against any form of like a movement that, funny enough, was similar to what happened in 51. And I think that if we had more discussion, we might have come up with a proper solution. But the Committee of 22, which you may know about,
yes,
didn't do us the honor of propelling and sort of having these discussions about nationhood and all that. They were more interested in fighting. I would say they were fighting for it, for what the anti-Gary forces were fighting for. My good friend Pamela Steele, a lady I have great respect for, seemed to think that the Committee of 22 were actually stoking the fire that encouraged all those protests that happened in November, December, and to January against independence. For whatever it's worth, I would say that Grenadians were always alert to things happening around them. It wasn't that they were passive at all. But having independence and getting independence seemed to have been, as far as Mr. Gary was concerned, the solution to this movement of everybody leaving the Federation and everybody wanting to go it alone. So he was going to be in the race too, to go it alone. And you could consider this a personal objective that he had. You could also consider it a national objective. But my feeling is that the revolution that happened in 1979 could not have happened if we were not independent. Independence paved the way for the success of the revolution in 1979. And its acceptance by the rest of the Caribbean and possibly the world.
Absolutely, absolutely, Mrs. Banfield. Now I'm going to bring back Dr. Grenade, who is the chairperson on of the subcommittee, and I want to make sure I get this correct. It is the subcommittee on history, identity, heritage, and documentation. Dr. Grenade, in respect of your subcommittee's mandate, what have you been able to accomplish thus far, and what impact has it had on the national community?
Well, thanks for that. We've actually started with quite a lot of activities. On September 5th, Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, who's a member of the committee, launched her book, The Collins Junior History of Grenada for Lower Secondary School Students, a very important contribution to Grenada's history, because we know we need to be teaching history, our own history, in our schools, and that's a major contribution. On November 29th, we launched the mobile museum, and I want to give credit to Dr. Angus Martin and his team for this mobile museum. It was launched in the St. George's Anglican Senior School, and it is part really of an educational outreach to showcase Grenada's history and heritage. And you know that there's a team from this Independent Secretariat, and I want to thank them for going around to the schools with this mobile museum. And I was told last week that they went to Carriacou and Petit Martinique, and the students there were saying they never saw a nutmeg. They never saw a cocoa in Carriacou and Petit Martinique. So I'm saying we have to do something about this in terms of ensuring that one Grenada is really one Grenada. So the mobile museum would be placed in schools, and the team would be there explaining history and heritage. On January 10th, Dr. John Angus Martin launched his A to Z of Grenada Heritage. Again, another major contribution to Grenada's history and heritage. What are some of the upcoming activities? We'll be having a series of town hall meetings throughout the country, including Grenada, including Carriacou and Petit Martinique. The first town hall meeting would be held on January 31st in the GBSS auditorium. The second would be held in Deluxe Cinema in Grenville on February 1st. The town hall meetings would be one people, one journey, one future, voices from within. We want to give Grenadians an opportunity to come out and just speak about Grenada, speak about what independence means, and more so, what do they see about as the way forward. I must say also on Friday gone, there was a youth symposium. It was very well attended. It was very energized. The young people were there, and I felt hopeful listening to the youth symposium. So the series of town hall meetings, we would have 2 before the 7th of February, and we'll have some others moving on. We also would have a virtual town hall meeting with the diaspora. This time we're using the same theme, but we're saying voices from the diaspora. Akima Paul Lambert has agreed to moderate that for us. Importantly as well, we're having a public lecture series. Kelan, we believe that independence cannot only be about cooking oil down and jumping up and, so we're having a public lecture series on the same theme. And the first one would be done by Mr. Ali Gill. And I really want to thank Ali for agreeing to do this. It would be on February 22nd at St. Patrick Anglican School. And we chose St. Patrick because of the significance, the historical significance of that parish. Dr. Candia Mitchell Hall would do the second. Akima Paul would do the third. I would do one later on in the year. So during this year, we'd have a series of public lecture series. Importantly, part of heritage, identity, documentation, Dr. Oliver Benoit, who is also a member of this subcommittee, he's organizing a retrospective exhibition featuring his work over the past 30 years. And this exhibition will be open on the 15th of February and run till the 30th of April at St. Paul's Community Center. We are really inviting people to come out to these events. The space will be transformed to a gallery showcasing 60 to 80 artworks. But what's important, there will be panel discussions. Scholars and artists will be coming from locally, regionally, and internationally to discuss different dimensions of art and education, art and the lessons from the Grenada Revolution, art and calypso, art and culture. So we really want to encourage people to attend this exhibition. And of course, the schools will be engaging as well. We'll also be conducting a series of interviews. We have lined up Sister Gloria Payne Banfield. I will be interviewing Clarice Charles, soon enough, a woman in politics, a trade unionist, an educator. So we have identifying people in the society that we want to sit with and just get them to speak about what Grenada means and what it means going forward. At the end of the year, we have an academic conference, an international conference on Grenada, reflecting on and projecting forward Grenada at 50. In October, hopefully, we hope to have that academic conference. So quite a lot is happening. We want to encourage the public to stay tuned, listen for dates and times. We will also be on things like Beyond the Headlines, to the point, and we ensure that the message of independence is problematized, that we analyze, that we discuss, that we hear from people, that we give people an opportunity. We think that people are hungry to talk about Grenada, and we want to create the environment for them to do so. So thanks for giving me this opportunity to make a plug.
Absolutely. Mrs. Payne Banfield, your role on the subcommittee, I imagine that someone of your import and experience would be bringing that valuable lived experience and historical knowledge to the subcommittee as well.
Well, I suppose that is from your point of view. From my point of view, I think I have a duty to share my experiences with my fellow nationals. But one thing I want to say is that Carriacou and Petit Martinique are going to be an integral part of our celebrations, because we must never forget that the African traditions in Carriacou are genuinely real, if we could put those two words together. You know, after 300 years, 400 years, where we were taken from Africa and brought to the Caribbean, in Carriacou, you can find manifestations of the same thing in Africa today. In short, the whole business of African heritage and ancestry lives daily in Carriacou and Petit Martinique. The nation dances, the wedding traditions, the whole oral tradition of the stick, the flag, the flags, and the cake, and all of that. They are the same as they used to be, and we in Grenada must recognize the fact that Carriacou is a very important aspect of our living heritage. It is there. Another thing I want to mention to you is that there is a religion that existed in West Africa called Orisha. And you can find evidence of that in a place called Munich. And Munich was called the keepers of the drums because they carried on the Orisha religion. And I would like to see the Orisha religion again brought out, exposed to the rest of Grenada, as it was in my childhood, where you understood, or you tried to understand, what they believed in and their belief system, so that we don't think of them not as non-Christian, but we think of them as a religion. And our Constitution says that we respect and recognize freedom of conscience. And so they have gone underground for many years, but we would like to see that happen. Or this being again a restoring that religion, so that people could appreciate, because right now Orisha is a world religion.
Mrs. Payne Banfield, I'm really glad you said this, and what better person to say it than you? Perhaps if I were to say it, they would think that I'm a rabble rouser, but I'm glad you said it, because that continues to be one of the enduring legacies of colonialism and slavery in Grenada. We have serious discrimination against people of the Orisha faith, against people of the Ifa faith, and against Rastafarians, as well as against the spiritual Baptist faith. Those are all indigenous African-oriented faith, spiritual practices that we continue to discriminate against. We do not see any of these faiths as part of any national event. No, we're talking about 50 years of independence. I would be subject to correction, but we do not see Rastafarians leading national prayer or invocations. We do not see spiritual Baptists as part of any national activity. There continues to be that stigma of evil, which we inherited from those who oppressed us against these faiths. So I'm really glad you made that point. Why do you think we continue to stigmatize our indigenous faiths?
I don't want to get into a discussion about religion. Definitely not.
Absolutely
because
not.
it's always very, But I would say that one thing that has survived is the drum. That's managed to survive from all that stigmatism and discrimination. I remember when the steel band movement started and the fellas were practicing in the village and you hear the drums and so on. And I remember when the police were told that there's drumming in the village, they would come up with the Black Maria to arrest the people who were doing it. And the fellas would throw the pans in the cane fields and run. And it was a sort of, you do not drum in the open. There was legislation against drumming in the open. You had to have a covering over the drums when you had a Saraka or a Orisha festival. And I think those bits of legislation still exist. I don't think anybody has
absolutely
looked into it.
In fact, I believe Trinidad and Tobago might be the only country in the English-speaking Caribbean to remove these oppressive and repressive colonial legislation on the book. And in fact, the late Prime Minister Basdio Pandey, he declared Spiritual Baptist Liberation Day a national holiday, while also repealing a lot of these ordinances that criminalized our own ancestry and heritage. But please proceed.
Yes, that's true. And we, as we follow Trinidad all the time, we should have followed them, but we didn't. We were still mired in colonialism. We were still mired in fear of the drum because we felt that it stirred up feelings of our ancestral connections with Africa. There was a movement, I think, to truncate or to dislocate any thought of being close to Africa. Throughout my education, I never learned anything about Africa. I never learned anything about Orisha except from the village pundits who followed the Orisha movement. So our education should be complete if we look where we come from. And where we come from has a rich cultural heritage. Africa had a university before Europe. In Ibadan, there was a university there before there was one in England or France. I think that we should be told the whole story. However, we were brought up to think that Africa was a dark continent, and out of it came dark people, and we were riddled and mad in class divisions and streamed into upper and lower and working, and that middle. Thank God, I think the revolution has gotten rid of all this class. It did, in fact. If anybody investigates the whole process of the revolution, they would see that it helped to get rid of the class discrimination in Grenada. But all is not lost. We still have some work to do in accepting our African heritage. in a real way. And when I say a real way, not the fact that, well, some of the African countries are rich, not means all of them are rich, and looking for loans and different things with them, but also their religion, their culture, their whole normative way of life and their values. All those things need to be explored and to see how we reflect that in the Caribbean.
Absolutely. This was very refreshing coming from you, especially Mrs. Payne Banfield. But I would bring back Dr. Grenade here for some closing comments. And I saw you were smiling here, but we quickly have to get to the next segment. But Dr. Grenada, you just articulated previously what the work of the committee will be doing. How do you hope to get national involvement? And you did say that many people have come forward to express interest in participating in a lot of the events. And what is the impact? What impacts do you hope that your public education activities would have beyond this capstone year of 50 years of independence?
Right. Thanks a lot. And I want to say I forgot a member of the committee, Brian Bullin, who is a very valuable member of the committee as well. Yes. We hope at the end of the day to not only celebrate for the sake of celebrating, but for example, the book that Dr. Philip Dow did, the book that Angus Martin did, these are long-lasting treasures, gifts to Grenada at 50. And we hope that as we do the public lecture series, as we do the academic conferences, as we meet in town hall meetings, we want to be able to capture those to ensure that we have a reservoir where people can go and find information. On Thursday, we did a session, Sister Gloria and I, in the Presbyterian Church for the Conference of Churches Grenada. And Sister Gloria said something I never imagined or even thought of. She said, if Grenada was not independent, Karani James could not have run in the Olympics as a Grenadian. He'd have had to be a British subject. We want to be able to have an impact where when we ask, what does it mean to be Grenadian? We understand who we are. It must impact self-definition. We must be able to revisit the independence compact we've had. But more so, we must be able to chart a future that is meaningful and purposeful, a future grounded in our common humanity. The next 50 years, Kellon, must be better than the last, because we understand that our sense of Grenadianness matters to all of us. And the one people, one journey, one future must be meaningful. We must understand what it is. We must understand that it is not sameness. It is unity, it is diversity. But we want to ensure, as Sister Gloria always says, we teach civics in school. So we have to, through this experience, rethink how we educate, what kind of education for what kind of society, what kind of economy, continuing to break the barriers, because there are still barriers. Class barriers, yes, not as perhaps it was before. So how do we put things in place to have social cohesion in our society, to have a society where we explore all the opportunities that the 21st century would offer? And how do we do so? Ensuring that the next 50 years, we have the institutions and the pillars that are necessary to strengthen our democracy, to build a society, to strengthen our nationhood. And again, I always say, to do that, we have to engage at the regional level, we have to engage at the international level, but we have to ensure that internally we have a society that is cohesive, that is healthy. We have to tackle things like crime, things like non-communicable diseases, climate change, and there's a lot of work that has to be done, a lot of unfinished business. I'll stop here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mrs. Payne Banfield, over to you for some final comments.
Final comments, never final, because there's also the need for continuing dialogue, continuing conversation. But what I'd like to say is that let us use this opportunity as a platform to continue the dialogue, to continue the conversation about who we are and where we're going and what we have to contribute to the world. We're going up.
Yes.
Within the context of that very infectious theme song. And in the spirit of Grenada's 50th anniversary of independence, I just want to let our viewers know that last evening at the residence of the ambassador of Grenada to Washington, D.C., they held I don't want to call it a gala. It was not a gala, but it was certainly a meet and greet for the Grenadian nationals in the Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. area. I had the privilege of attending that event. I was invited to attend the event. And so you can catch footage of that event that was held last evening by Grenada's incoming ambassador to the Washington, D.C. area. Catch that event on our social media page, on the Facebook page of the Bub Report. Folks, what we want to do is that we want to take a quick break and come back and have a very important conversation around migrant workers. There are many temporary farm workers from Grenada and other islands of the Caribbean visit Canada every year to work on Canadian farms. There is a significant farm labor shortage there, but that is coming up with some significant challenges in respect of how these farm workers are treated. So we are going to, during our break, we will go down memory lane, and we would actually replay an interview that we had with two former prime ministers of Grenada, the late Ben Jones and the late George Brizan, as well as a former cabinet minister, that's Mrs. Nadia Benjamin. I actually had the opportunity to interview these wonderful folks back in 2003. The footage is a bit dated and choppy, but I felt it was important, given Grenada is on the cusp of celebrating 50 years, to replay that footage. So folks, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back after these messages. Please stand by.
One or the other.
Don't go there.
You are a technocrat. I mean, you can speak to whether or not it was appropriate or inappropriate for that to occur. Would you have done that as a permanent secretary?
Politicians get the information from wherever source that they can.
That's going to be the extent of your answer.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
There's a lot of noise around the data protection bill that, in my respectful view, is not warranted.
I was one of those making noise, and it's simply because I was concerned about that specific section 33.
Don't go there.
Are you going to be offering yourself up as political leader of the party?
I see you've called me here for much more than diplomatic passports. I don't buy that.
Don't go there.
What is the relationship like between you and your leader, Dr. Mitchell, your boss, Dr. Mitchell?
I'm not sure how to explain how to answer this question at this time. I prefer not to answer.
Don't go there.
They said that you approached the bank for the loan before the election and that it only materialized after the election. There are also conflicting reports around the quantity of monies that were received. What is the reality here?
People try to extort the truth and to make all kinds of things about it. I just stay quiet. So if you notice, I was really and truly quiet about the whole matter.
Well, except with not with the New Today newspaper. The New Today newspaper reported on this, so I'm not sure you were quiet on this. Go ahead, Honorable. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to answer your question, right?
Don't go there.
I think we just spoke at length about the regularization framework. So
yes, we did. But let us talk, Prime Minister. Let us talk about the workers who are dismissed.
The Bub Report. We go there.
Should your loved ones pass on, they deserve to be treated with dignity. And at S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, we can provide you with that service. We can take you every step of the way during your sorrowful moments. When that need arises, call S.A. Johnson Funeral Home at 347-777-9797. That's 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home is a Caribbean family-owned funeral home here in Brooklyn, providing funeral services, but in a dignified way. From cremation to burial to the repatriation of your loved ones, you don't have to go through the hassle, as we provide exceptional service that allows you to mourn and heal peacefully. For more information, visit our website, www.sajohnsonfuneral.org. Send us an email at sajfuneral@aol.com or call 347 777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, because you deserve to be treated with dignity.
Was wrong. Our statehood constitution made provision for moving to independence along two lines. Either we requested, the government of Grenada requested, in which case we must hold a referendum in the country and get a 2/3 majority in support, or the English might, under one of the heads there, decide to give independence to Grenada. Mr. Gary was requesting independence, and that's how the independence thing proceeded. But we felt that he had not made the necessary, he had not made this an issue and allowed the population as such to express itself.
Independence came, of course, on February 7, 1974. But it was not a pleasant kind of independence where everybody celebrated and everything. There was too much division, conflicts. They were very deep. Economically, Grenada continued to be a producer and exporter of raw material, and it continued to lose all the benefits of value added to countries abroad that imported its raw material. So Grenada remained in a state of what we describe in economics as dependent on the development.
Nadia Benjamin was one of the female members of the Gary cabinet upon Grenada's attainment of political independence. Looking back 29 years ago, Benjamin is reminiscent of one of the most interesting times in our colorful history as a nation.
He went to England accompanied by his Deputy Prime Minister Hubert Prudhomme, and they had discussions with the British government, and when they came back we were told that he had independence in the bag. So based on what he was told, he came back and he decided, apparently they said to him, this is what I gathered, that if you want independence you must go to the polls and get a mandate from the people. So in 1972 he went to the polls and he got a mandate from the people with 14 out of 15 seats. I think the only seat that was in the opposition at the time was Mr. Herbert Blaise, a member for Carriacou. So based on the elections, he was able to go back to England, and accompanied by Mr. Herbert Blaise again, he was granted the privilege to go ahead and have independence for Grenada.
Hello everyone, I am Chantal McGuire, the local bred Grenadian actuary and asset liability management expert. Are you satisfied with your current finances? Are you curious and constantly looking for ways to make additional income? Join me on the Bob Report as we strive to empower you, our valued audience, to become more financially literate and help evolve Grenadians into a mindset that's investment focused and entrepreneurial. Literacy is about freedom. It's about being able to control your money and not letting your money control you. It's about foresight for a brighter future. Our core mission is to promote financial literacy and share money-generating opportunities for everyone. Join us on the last Sunday of every month, starting July 30th, as we strive to provide the keys to financial freedom.
And welcome back to this week's episode of the Bub Report. Now, a proposed class action lawsuit filed in Ontario last month says those programs, which brought more than 70,000 workers to Canada on temporary visas in 2021, violate charter rights by forcing the workers to work for a single employer and pay into government benefits that almost none of them can actually claim. Now, in 1966, workers from Jamaica began migrating to Canada under the Seasonal Agriculture Worker Program on temporary visas to work on farms. The program has since expanded over the years as Canada forged agreements with other countries, including Grenada and other countries in the Eastern Caribbean, such as St. Vincent and St. Lucia, and introduced another separate stream of agricultural workers under the temporary foreign worker program. Now, in 1966, as I said before, seasonal workers began immigrating from Jamaica to work on these farms in Canada. And of course, there is also a farm labor shortage in Canada, which means that the demand continues to expand for this program. Now, here to discuss this issue are Mr. Chris Ramsarup of the Justice for Migrant Workers Organization, Mr. Louis Sentry, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who is a civil litigation attorney, as well as Saeed Hussain, who is the executive director of the Migrant Workers Alliance. Now, as a programming note, we did invite the Deputy Labor of Commissioner in Grenada, but she declined to appear after initially agreeing to appear, citing diplomatic concerns if they were to speak out in relation to this particular subject. So, gentlemen, welcome to this week's edition of the Bub Report, and it's a pleasure having all of you here.
Good morning. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Absolutely. Now, this particular farm labor program is a pretty, it's a pretty long-standing program, and I will begin with you, Saeed. I'll begin with Saeed here. Talk to us about the conditions under which a lot of these migrant workers are I don't even want to say forced to work, but based on, are obligated to work based on their contractual arrangements.
So migrant farm workers in Canada are forced to live on employer-controlled housing, which is substandard and inhumane. People are being warehoused one on top of each other. They are tied to their employers. What that means is that if a worker is not able to change his job easily, it means that if you stand up against a bad boss, the boss can evict you. So now you're homeless. They also have the ability to kick you out of the country. This is not legal, but it's happening, and they can ban you from returning. So when you are facing exploitation, I mean, imagine, many of us know how bad it is when bad employers treat us, but for migrant farm workers, it also means eviction, homelessness, deportation, and being banned from the country. So as a result, people are facing low wages, they're facing exploitation, racist remarks, bosses who are controlling and surveilling them, bosses who are refusing to give them any amount of freedom. 2 years ago, Jamaican farm workers wrote a letter calling it systematic slavery. So the conditions are incredibly bad, and Canadian labor laws largely don't apply, and it has been very difficult for people to get justice.
Mm-hmm. And you say Canadian labor laws don't apply. I'm going to bring in Attorney Sentry here. How could Canadian labor laws not apply to the protection of workers? Is it because there is a special carve out in respect of how this particular temporary guest worker program is set up?
Well, there's a number of answers to that, because of course there's many different laws that might apply to protect workers, right? So part of the answer is that, as you suggest, there are carve-outs. So for example, farm workers are excluded from the ability to unionize in their workplace. And that has a racist and unjust legacy. And there's no real reason why that law continues. There's another law, of course, which is employment insurance, right? EI is a system in Canada that for most workers provides the ability to have some safety net if you lose your job, right? So any work that is insurable, which is almost all work, requires an employer to deduct a certain amount of your salary, and that money is paid to the government in premiums, right? And these workers, migrant workers from Grenada and other farm workers who come to the country, pay into this scheme annually. We estimate that tens of millions of dollars are paid, and of course they have no choice in the matter, into the EI program every year by migrant farm workers alone. But because of tied work that Mr. Huson just explained, these workers are actually excluded from any ability to access EI benefits when they lose their job. Because what tied work means is it says the moment you lose your job, you A, are no longer authorized, right, to work, and B, you don't have status to be in the country. And as a requirement to get EI, you need to both be in the country and be ready and available to work. So these are just two examples of basic rights and protections that, because of how this program is set up and designed, migrant farm workers are actually excluded from the ability to access them. And I just had one final note, which is that even the laws that do apply, these migrant farm workers are practically unable to access them because of the fears that are involved when asserting your rights because of tied work. So even if you have a theoretical entitlement to a statutory benefit, for example, you may be reticent to raise these concerns, to go to the labor tribunal, what have you, because you know the degree of power that this employer wields over you isn't just power over your job, right? It's a power over your very ability to work in the industry, to be in Canada, right? And that degree of power imbalance is created, is manufactured by the design of this program. And one of the arguments in our case is that it just has no place in a free and democratic country. And the degree of power imbalance that comes from tied employment has to end.
Especially a democratic country like Canada, which claims to be especially exceptional, civilizationally exceptional, much better than the neighbors to the south. So this is very interesting there. But speaking of worker treatment, Mr. Ramsarup, I'm going to bring you in here. Welcome to the Bub Report, and thank you for being flexible, because I know that I appreciate your busy schedule. But can you talk about those conditions that Saeed touched on earlier, in which a lot of the workers live and are obligated to stay in when they are in Canada? You know, you hear stories about the living quarters. You hear stories about the abuse that they receive from their employers. You hear stories about issues of access to occupational, or lack of access to occupational health and safety protocols. Talk about those conditions, please.
First, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I think it's really important for audiences in Grenada and all across the Caribbean, and for Caribbean peoples to understand, we're not talking about managed migration. We're not talking about guest worker schemes. We are talking about an indentured system of labor to build, to fuel, to feed a plantation economy in the global north. So it's important for us to start about that. Many of us have this history about understanding what indentured labor is and the power of the plantation class to basically subordinate and subjugate Caribbean peoples. And that's exactly the same system that's happening in Ontario, across Canada, but also the United States as well too, where there is a systemic power imbalance that exists, where workers are disempowered as a result of the exclusion of protections at work, through provisional regimes, and federal laws that say if you stand up for your rights, there's a very strong chance that you're not going to be able to return the following year. Deplorable housing conditions in the province of Ontario and across Canada exist because agricultural workers do not have any protections under the law. plain and simple. If you live on an employer's property, you do not have the ability, the Residential Tenancies Act, no protections under health and safety. It's a legal no man's land, to put it bluntly, that exists where nobody takes responsibility. This is why deplorable housing continues. The fact, as Hassan mentioned earlier, the fact that these housing conditions are tied to the employment sites where workers are basically living next to or on top of a greenhouse, for example. The fact that, whether we're talking about New York State or Ontario, agricultural workers are denied, all agricultural workers, whether we're talking about workers from the Caribbean or from elsewhere, overtime laws, holiday laws, the right to minimum hours of work. And the term that a lot of people use to describe these type of, not just simply the programs, but the type of power that the employers have is agricultural exceptionalism, where the industry basically gets what it wants, tax breaks, lax laws to create and to keep fueling this plantation system. I want to actually just maybe one more thing before I be quiet, I promise, is we keep saying that there is a labor shortage. We keep hearing the farmers say that. But really what we're talking about is, number one, Canadian agriculture is trying to expand its global footprint. Most of the places, most of the farms that farm workers are working on that come from Grenada, from Trinidad, Jamaica, or for export production. Leamington, and I'm just in Windsor, Ontario right now, the Leamington greenhouse capital, most of that is for the United States. That export production is for the United States. For the comrades working in British Columbia, a lot of that's both for overseas markets, United States. Our ginseng is for Asia. Tobacco, where many workers from the Caribbean still work on, is for the United States. So this is fueling a export-oriented system, right? This is not, when you hear the Canadian employers, Canadian government officials speaking, they're going to say that this is to feed Canada. If we can't have migrant farm workers, Canadians are going to starve. What's going to happen here is we're not going to be able to have an export agricultural system, but we have to question why our food system is developed in such a way where we're trying to expand globally, and in many instances trying to have a very negative impact on countries of the global south through our systems of dumping food.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned there, and I'm going to bring back Mr. Sentry here. You talk about overtime. Overtime laws do not apply to them. How many hours do these farmers work? I mean, there are a lot of Grenadian farmers in the program, and I know that there is a Grenadian attached to this particular lawsuit as well, which Mr. Sentry would articulate. But talk about those working hours.
I can start, and then Mr. Sentry can go afterwards. What we do, and I want to be clear, this is not an exaggeration. I want to be straight up here. All right. Workers are working 50 to 60 hours. We have some of the comrades working up to 84 hours a week, starting at 5 or 6 in the morning. Some are going to 8, 9, 10, 11 at night. Many workers, particularly in the greenhouse, allege, and they consistently say over and over again, that they are not getting any type of overtime. They have to work 7 days a week, and it's exhausting, grueling, tough work.
That is putting it mildly, especially in that oppressive summer heat, which affects everywhere in the world, especially Canada as well in the summer. But Mr. Sentry, I'm going to bring you back here, sir. And now let us talk about the lawsuit that you are signatory to. There is a Grenadian plaintiff in that lawsuit as well. Can you talk about how that Grenadian plaintiff got involved in the lawsuit? And is he still employed in Canada? And obviously, given that he's part of the lawsuit, I don't imagine that they might want to have him back in Canada again, right? So talk about that, please.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily assume that latter point. You know, Mr. Ramsarup, a really incredible organizer, and actually he is also best positioned to speak about the history here with Mr. Peters. But he, you know, worked in Canada for a number of years on a number of contracts. You know, his experience is in many ways not unique. During the pandemic, of course, many farm workers were stranded here and continued working and spent even longer periods without coming home to visit their family. Mr. Peters' contract was renewed, and he, at a certain point in 2022, I believe, finally returned home after not visiting his family, his 2 young kids, for 3 years. And while he was on this trip home, his job was terminated with no reasons given, right? And we call that without cause. Now, the consequence of having your job terminated when you're physically outside the country is that you're not just, as I said, losing your job, you're out of the program, right? Your ability to access this entire industry is foreclosed. And his experience in some ways exemplifies the kind of broader injustices, which is that these employers are given, they don't have this inherently, right? Employers don't normally wield this much power over their workers. They're given this degree of power because of tied employment, because of how the program is created by the government of Canada. And that creates the conditions for abuse. That's why this lawsuit is against the government of Canada and not, dozens of employers, right? What we're challenging is a structural, systemic injustice that is created in the policy, right? And you may want to, I don't know if we're going to speak about this more, but I'll just mention it briefly here. But this all begs the question: why is it that a policy of tied employment that is so problematic and that is so susceptible to abuse, why is it that we continue to impose this, and why do we impose it in the first place? And this raises what is a very dark history, a very shameful history for Canada, especially, and that may well contradict the kind of general perception of the country by some. The historical explanation for why tied employment was imposed on Caribbean farm workers specifically, beginning in 1966, was overt racist beliefs held by policymakers. 1966 wasn't the first year that Canada began importing farm workers. Of course, Canada had need for farm labor for years and years before that, and typically preferred, again for racist reasons, farm workers from European countries. And before 1966, there were regular debates with the farmers, with the employers, arguing that they should have the power to deport the worker, that there should be tied employment because they wanted to ensure that workers stayed on the farm. And these proposals were consistently rejected on grounds that ministers and policymakers said that Canada was a free country. Of course, during those years before 1966, Black Caribbean farm workers were generally barred from the country altogether, right? Again, for racist reasons. So Canada still had racist immigration policies back in those years. And so you had a system where you had generally European farm workers coming to the country. They were given job freedom because Canada recognized the fact that freedom at work is a fundamental freedom in the country. And Black workers were not coming for the Caribbean. 1966, of course, this changes, and Canada imposes tied employment for the first time. And if you look at the historical records, and if you've read the claim summarizes some of these statements made by ministers and so on at the time. The reason why tied employment and this specific system was imposed was because the government didn't want these racialized workers and was concerned about so-called racial problems. Of course, these are concerns that go back to the 1960s. And if you ask Canadian ministers today, they would tell you, of course, they reject that kind of racism. The problem is that the policy that was motivated by these racist attitudes has continued all these years, and somehow we've forgotten the racial motivations for the policy in the first place. So what we are trying to do, hoping to do with this lawsuit, is to draw attention to the fact that these policies, tied employment specifically, not only has kind of systemic racist impacts, right, in the harms that it causes to a racialized workforce, but actually these were intentional. This was the purpose of the policy all along, was to prevent these workers from immigrating to the country and to segregate them to communities where there wouldn't be so-called racial problems. And I'm just quoting the ministers from the 1960s. It's time for, this is when I say there's no place for this kind of a policy in a free and democratic society like Canada's. What I really mean is that a policy that was motivated by overt racism can't continue in this day and age. And these workers have to have a basic freedom that all other workers have, which is if they're in a difficult position, if they're facing exploitation or abuse, they have to have the basic freedom. And that's what it is. It's just a basic freedom to change jobs, right? To take their labor elsewhere. This is autonomy, right? This is not complicated stuff. This is really what it means to be in a free society, right? And yet we continue to subject these particular racialized workers to conditions of unfreedom, and we did it for racist reasons, right? And it's time for Canada to reckon with that history and to change course.
Mr. Hussain, I see you nodding here. Let us talk about the litigants here, two of the litigants who are part of this lawsuit. And the work that you and Mr. Ramsarup does in respect of advocating for these workers. Now, these workers, obviously, they do not have a voice because if there is this proverbial big stick over their heads that if they speak out, that this is what is going to happen to you. I can't believe we're having this conversation in 2024, but here we are. So, could you talk about how critical the work of your advocacy is, and Mr. Ramsarup's advocacy is in getting those workers' voices to the public domain?
Absolutely. I mean, what we do is we run a 24-hour hotline over WhatsApp, both in English and Spanish. And I'll just give you the number for anyone who has a farm worker relative or friend or a farm worker themselves. And that's 905-324-2840. And we are hearing, thousands of migrant farm workers from the Caribbean calling us, complaining about labor exploitation. But these workers are not remaining quiet. They are going to their bosses and they're demanding better wages. They are going on wildcat strikes. They are filming what they are doing and they're putting it out on social media. And that's really what has made this issue so alive, right? The fact that we are having this conversation is because migrant workers bravely spoke up, stood up, and faced reprisals. Chris's organization, Justice for Migrant Workers, released a video of some Jamaican farm workers and they were sent back. And that created a massive crisis. And then those workers are being brought back in. So I do want to say workers are fighting back. They're speaking up. They are, making they're making court cases. They're speaking up in Parliament. And that has not been enough to change the Canadian government. And I think that is, what Louis is talking about and Chris are talking about is the crisis, is that the power of the agri-food lobby, it's a feudal mindset. They really want to own people that they can constantly exploit and have the power to get rid of them overnight. But there is a role to play by the countries in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Grenada, etc. Because one of the powers that the employers have is that they can ban you from the program, or they can fire you and then actually force you to not be able to get back on the program. This is called blacklisting. And no systems really fundamentally have been developed for a complaints process. Grenada, Jamaica, all of these countries must treat these workers as whistleblowers. So if they said, hey, if a worker is being sent back, because workers fear speaking up because it means being sent back and not being able to work again. But if Grenada and Jamaica treated them like whistleblowers and said, we would put them back on the program because we have learned and actually listened to the workers and protect them and identify those bad employers and show the Canadian government what was happening. But the problem is, Chris was talking about how Canada is an agri-food exporter, right? Like right now, it's the 5th largest agri-food exporter in the world. Just the profits of the agri-food industry is greater than the GDP of Jamaica and of Grenada, right? This is massive amount of money. And many countries are relying on remittances because of this, we're talking about here 50 years down, but we know that the name of colonialism has been overthrown, but the underdevelopment that happened in the Caribbean has still not been fixed. And so the government is trying to export people so that those workers can send money and remittances. And so they have a interest. So there's the shared interest between the racist Canadian government, as Louis explained, the feudal landlords type mentality of the agri-food, and the sending countries who want to export people. And so have an interest in silencing workers who speak up. There are absolutely good liaison officers, of course, and there are people who are trying to speak up and do the right thing. But there's also the opposite. So I think we need to think about all of the ways in which justice can be reached.
And I'm glad you mentioned Caribbean governments, because this is a a message that we received from Grenada's Minister of Labor, who was actually invited to be part of this week's panel. She said, quote, the seasonal agricultural workers, and of course, that's Sparkle Grenade Courtney, who is the acting Labor Commissioner in Grenada. Her deputy Labor Commissioner was Miss McQuilkin, was initially invited, but she responded, not Miss McQuilkin, she responded. And her message was, quote, I'm going to read part of it, not all of it. She said, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program has been an area of cooperation and partnership between Canada and Grenada for decades, and is an important source of overseas employment for our local citizens. We value this relationship and the benefits our citizens derive from it. We will therefore speak to any concerns with the program through appropriate channels. Now, in this particular message, it's framed as if it is beneficial to obviously the employment generation, but this is the other side of the coin here. So talk about the bilateral framing here in respect of the, and this is a question to you, Mr. Sentry, the bilateral relationship that Canada has with the countries that have these seasonal farm labor programs. Do you believe that that these countries should be doing much more to ensure the welfare of their citizens as guest workers in Canada?
You know, I think I would echo Syed's comments in that regard, but I will defer this question to Chris. He has just years and years of experience in this regard, and I'm a litigator, but I can't claim to have the richness of and depth of knowledge and history
absolutely.
here.
Yeah. So Chris, let's hear you on this.
The contracts were developed and negotiated by employers, the Canadian government officials, and the government officials of the Caribbean and Mexico separately. There's been no voices for workers at this table. And even if workers were, or NGOs or anybody else at this point, the power imbalance at that table, the table's been set up in such a way that the voices of workers are not welcomed and are not seen as warranted. Many years ago, somebody had filed a Freedom of Information request to look at the minutes of these meetings. And you saw the needs of the employers, Canadian employers, and the Canadian government at the top. And then you saw the needs of the workers around EI and other issues that are happening way at the bottom, and that wasn't even really addressed. Those meetings would happen, and the agenda would be too long. That would never be even touched. So I think that speaks to the role of the exclusion and the power imbalance that once exists during these contracts. These contracts are racial contracts. They're domination contracts where workers' voices are not part of this, and it's instilled in this idea of racism. If you're thinking about, and when we look at the indentured labor contracts that brought many of our families to the Caribbean, it's very similar. The connection, the similarities is not a surprise, right? And the way that control exists within those contracts, first and foremost. To the countries of the Caribbean, this should not be a race to the bottom, plain and simple. What happens right now is that workers from Grenada, for standing up for their rights, will be sent back home. They will be replaced by workers from Guatemala, from Thailand, from Jamaica. So very much all the countries of the Caribbean, the global South, in fact, are competing with one another for these few positions that exist. And we have to basically put a stop to this type of divide and rule that's happening, first and foremost. In the message you read, the key thing that for me, the so-called appropriate voices or appropriate representatives.
Appropriate, yes.
Yes, appropriate representatives. And that for me is a concern as well, too, particularly when our organization and all the other organizations have been not only bringing up concerns, but taking on issues around workplace violations, workplace injuries. Countries of the Caribbean, even the Canadian government officials do not have that expertise. It's been a lot of volunteers who for decades have been trying to evolve the legal system that's happening here as well, too. And with the messaging that the government officials from Grenada in this particular telling us is that they don't want to try to work to make things better. They don't want the expertise that's been evolving for many generations now to try to make things better, particularly for injured workers, unemployed workers, people who've been disbarred, as Mr. Hassan has talked about, for standing up for their rights. And that should be a concern for people of Grenada, that the people up here who are trying to push bit by bit, that we're not getting the support that we need for the work that we are trying to do here.
Mr. Hussain, I saw you nodding there. React to this message, first of all.
I think, I agree absolutely with Chris, right? What we are seeing is governments, because it is a beneficial arrangement, and it is. I think the question that needs to be asked is, why is it that Grenada must export people, right? Why is it that Grenada is in this situation? Why is Jamaica in this situation? Why is Mexico and Thailand and Guatemala, as Chris mentioned, are in this situation? And how's that going to end? There's actually a massive industrialization that's been taking place for many years, automation that's been taking place for many years. And over time, eventually, these jobs will disappear, right? But a number of workers who've come here, as you heard, working for 80 hours a day, will return to Grenada sick, injured, at the end of their lives, without good access to CPP, which is the pension plan, which they paid into also. And so what's happening is people are being exported and they're coming back injured and sick. They've managed to get money, but they've been separated from their families for many years. And many workers who come up to the north don't feel like they can talk about their struggles because, they're like, maybe we're better than we were back home. There's a lot of difficulty in workers being able to tell the truth of their experience. People are proud. They don't want to talk about the racism they experienced or the overwork. They don't want their families to be upset. They feel like they'll make things worse for the others. So this climate of silencing and fear and repression that has been created by the systemic laws that Luis is talking about has had a massive effect on families and individuals and communities. So I think, as Chris said, we're trying to build power, and we will happily talk to any government to explain to them what they can do better. I'm sure Chris will. At the same time, the Canadian government is primarily responsible because it is the governing authority, right? They are the ones who created these exclusions from labor laws like minimum wage and overtime pay. They are the ones who've made it impossible for people to get EI. They are the ones who've created tied work permits and denied permanent residence. They are the ones who over half a century have created the system of indentured labor. So our task here is to support migrants to fight back. And I think I would say to the Grenadian officials who are not here today is that their own workers have really good ideas about how to change the system, and they need to listen to them, right? And we have to have a bigger conversation about the state of the global economy, where Canada has this massive power to export people.
Chris and Said, what results have your activism yielded in respect of a response from the federal government of Canada, or even from the government of Ontario?
I think the best way for myself to answer it, and then Mr. Hassan is probably going to have a different way to examine, is that I try to think about the over 20, 30 years, even before our involvement. Workers have found different ways to try to resist, to try to organize, to fight back against these conditions. They've been, sharing this information with workers, as we go on. So I think, first of all, workers have been organizing, have been trying to share information and trying to resist and come together. That's the first important thing to think about. And it's becoming generational, where lessons that our grandfathers, great-grandfathers learned are now being sent with children. So I think that's the first part of it. Number two, I think all of our organizing through the mobilization, workplace mobilizations, the exposés, the legal challenges have to be seen as part of a larger structure, a larger vision of change, of saying that if people are coming to work, they should come with permanent status. They should come as people who are free, not people who have to work and endure indentured conditions. So we call for changes at the federal level. Very much before the arrival of Jamaican workers and workers from Grenada, from Trinidad, from Mexico, people came to Canada and were able to live here as free people, as permanent residents. So saying that it's inherent that our immigration laws are not being used to divide workers based on nationality, based on race, first and foremost, but also at the same time, putting pressure provincially for changes at our labor laws to say that workers should have a right to form unions, the right to decent health care, the right to workers' compensation, the right to health and safety in the workplace. So it's a multi-pronged process that, litigation is one part of it. Access to justice is another part. Telling stories and making sure that workers could come together, and to continue to pressure the Canadian and provincial officials to say that what's happening now was never acceptable, but today this is not acceptable.
Absolutely. And in respect of outreach to government officials, do you know whether any of the migrant farmers you've worked with actually petitioned their own in-country governments in respect of these issues? Saeed or Chris, any one of you can take this?
I can jump in, Chris, and then you can go ahead.
Yes.
I mean, also on your previous question in terms of sort of victories and challenges, I absolutely agree with Chris. I mean, it's about the building of the power that will create the thing. You know, Chris is my comrade, but also my teacher. I think we have had the work that they have done has been incredibly powerful in creating the situation where all of this change is happening. In terms of, you know, I'll just give you one example. Last week, we had a meeting with the Minister of Labor from Jamaica, along with a number of workers who had been blacklisted, right? And that happened because workers wrote this open letter calling it systemic slavery, which forced the Jamaican government to send a fact-finding mission to Canada. But you know what happened? In the report, they said everything's fine. So workers did speak up, but that Minister of Labor has been replaced, and the new Minister of Labor is willing to meet, and let's see if they can create some actual changes. We certainly hope that they do. But it was workers talking about their experience because there's a committee now of former Jamaican farm workers that's been meeting with the government. Similarly, in Mexico, a number of displaced workers, you know, blacklisted workers, actually went to the presidential palace last year and delivered a letter signed by hundreds of migrant farm workers about the mistreatment. And the president's palace started a conversation with them. So absolutely, workers are calling on their governments to take action. I think the problem, unfortunately, is that you know, first of all, there is this dismissal of working class people. There is this notion that working class people don't know what their reality is. Sometimes workers will say, oh, that's a problem person because there's a fear of losing their jobs.
A troublemaker.
No, that's a troublemaker, right? But the reality is, you know, all of the things that I've said about whistleblower protections and having complaints divisions within the Caribbean countries to make sure people are not blacklisted. These are all ideas from our members who are migrant farm workers who themselves have proposed it. So it is a multi-tier, it is a global struggle, right? Working people, whether they're in Grenada or Jamaica or Mexico or in Canada, we are a single united people. And when bosses exploit us, we have to use all methods at our disposal, including, as Chris said, you know, this legal case that Justicia is bringing forward with Luis and others. So, yes, I mean, it's happening. And I think that I would encourage any Grenadian, any Caribbean, any farm worker, any family of a farm worker person to get in touch with us, to get in touch with Chris and Justicia, and to be part of this struggle and to say, look, many workers are moving, and you can join us, and together we can win the changes that are needed because it is political collective pressure that will actually force the Canadian government to change this exploitative system.
Chris?
Similar. There's always been, you know, right from the beginning. And I remember watching and seeing the newspaper excerpts of workers from different countries trying to petition, trying to go to their member of parliaments to raise these issues. But I also think that workers are cognizant. They do not want sweet talk. They don't want to go there and have their politicians basically lie to their faces or not take this issue on. I hope that, you know, that the Grenadian officials, while they may not want to appear with us for so-called diplomatic reasons, are putting the calls to the Canadian officials and saying that change must happen. I think it's imperative that that does occur. But irrespective of what the government officials say, whether the Canadians or the from the Caribbean or from Mexico, we're all going to continue our work. We're going to continue to chip away. With respect to injured migrant farm workers from across the Caribbean, they've also been organizing as well, too, for changes to our workers' compensation system. There was a significant victory that happened a little while ago. We're trying to expand that to ensure that all injured workers are treated with respect and dignity and don't face the racist discrimination that, you know, we've been naming over and over again as well, too. So the work will continue in spite of the obstacles that exist. And I think, you know, it's important for people in Grenada not to see us as a threat. We're not saying that people should not come to work. We're not saying that we want to mash up or jeopardize somebody's ability to work. But there's more people, in our opinion, who are being discriminated against, losing their work for standing up for their rights, being injured, being sick. And it's ensuring that those voices and those comrades are not forgotten in this larger scheme of the temporary foreign worker systems of Canada.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, I'm going to get to Mr. Sentry and then I'll come back to you for some closing comments. But Mr. Sentry, talk to us about the timeline of this particular litigation. It was just filed. Talk about logistically what happens next. Would there be a process of discovery? How long would this take?
Yeah, so this is a class action filed in Ontario, meaning the two individuals who came forward as plaintiffs are actually called representative plaintiffs, and they're going to be representing the interests of all migrant farm workers who came to Canada over the last 15 years. It's a very large class. And the first procedural step in any class actions is called certification, which is essentially an approval process before the court, where the court decides if this case is appropriately brought as a class action. And there will be a public hearing for certification, which I would expect would take place towards the end of this year or early next year. They're long timelines for their big cases, but that's the next big step, is certification, and there's going to be evidence filed and a public hearing. And if the court certifies the case, then we proceed with the class action. And as you alluded to, the next major step would be discoveries and disclosure of documents and evidence relevant to the case. It'll be a long fight, we're committed to the struggle, and we really think that this case is the culmination of years and years of advocacy. The issues raised in the case are not new, but what we're trying to do is call attention to the fact that these are real constitutional rights that we're talking about that have been violated for many years. And it's time for the government to have to account for that and defend that in court.
Now, this lawsuit is not being brought against the individual farm owners. Yes, it's been brought against the Canadian government. I just want to be
that's right. That's
yes?
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's tied employment really is the center of this lawsuit. It's asking the government to justify why they are not affording basic job freedom to these workers, when that historically was the approach taken to various other farm workers who immigrated to the country. And of course, one of the significant consequences of that is the exclusion from EI, which has actually enriched the Canadian government, right, by hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 15 years alone. And this is just based on public data we can find on the government websites, Statistics Canada. We estimate almost $500 million, $472 million Canadian, in premiums, EI premiums collected by the government. And it's really, I just want to pause here. It's really unconscionable. It's an insult to injury, because EI really is supposed to be a safety net for workers. And some of the most vulnerable and marginalized workers in the country who are already the subject of various discriminatory laws, right, then pay into a program because they have no choice, which they're then structurally excluded from accessing. And Canada has been enriched, we say in a legal term of art, unjustly enriched by almost $500 million just over the last 15 years. And so that's just, the first step in our view is we need to get some compensation for these workers who have, been unjustly deprived of these funds. But of course, the larger aim of the litigation is to change some of the policies that are causing these problems in the first place.
As you indicated, it will be a long road ahead. And of course, we have some viewer comments now, and then we would get to some of those viewer comments and get you to chime in here. Hudson George is saying the farm workers program is politicized in the Caribbean by politicians. If a Caribbean government participating in the farm program, the opposition parties will criticize the government and say that it's wrong. I see, Chris, you're nodding here.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen, in Trinidad and Jamaica, from my experiences, the way that this is thrown around as a political hot potato, and each party is trying to outmaneuver another. I think we have to think about the interests of the Caribbean peoples, right? So the people of Grenada should be thinking about what's their interest, and that's ensuring that when people are coming to Canada, that they are having decent working conditions and decent housing first and foremost, and not basically trying to use this to gain votes. So I think first and foremost, I'll let you continue. I know what people are going to be critiquing us of, but I'll come back in a second when I get one of those.
Unison Joseph is saying, morning, what role is the OECS desk playing? We have some Grenadian farm workers losing employment, and in one case, a machine injured one, and he was sent home. What are some of the policies are putting in place to correct this? Now, the OECS desk, I think here is referring, there is a labor desk at the OECS level, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Now, gentlemen, I don't expect you to respond to that part, but the second part of the question here has to do with injuries, those injuries that occur on those farms.
So Unison, my cell number is 647, area code 647-834-4932. For the injured comrade, please reach out to me and I'll put you in contact with a few of my other friends who are helping with that type of support. So please get in touch with me around that. And once again, it's been a conflict with OECS officials and the inability to support the work that we're doing to try to raise and improve conditions for workers, first and foremost. So it's definitely been a challenge with all government officials from the Caribbean who continue to be threatened by the advocacy that many of us are taking on. I also want to say, I want to give kudos to Louis for years of trying to think through this and put this action forward. Some people might be saying, well, these are so-called foreign nationals. Why should they get access to our EI system? Why is this pertinent? Why should this be relevant? And I'm sitting and I could watch Detroit right now from my hotel window. I'm right by the Detroit River. And what's important for us to understand is that Canada and the United States has had an agreement since the 1940s. It's an interstate agreement for commuters. So if you're a Canadian that works in the United States and vice versa, those citizens can have access to benefits to our unemployment scheme. We have to start thinking that the farm workers who come up to Canada year after year, 80 to 90%, this is their sole form of employment. They keep coming year after year. So this is their labor attachment, which is a term which we use for our EI system. When workers are returning home, they face significant levels of underemployment and unemployment. If they were a Canadian seasonal worker working in a greenhouse or in an apple facility or tobacco field, and they have enough hours of work, they would be eligible. If we are so grateful and so happy of having a transnational labor force, then they should have portable rights, the same rights as any other person that works in Canada. And that's been our challenge to people who are naysayers about what we're trying to do. And if we are also, for the naysayers who are saying that we're just being rabble-rousers, why should anybody in the 21st century be tied to an employer, denied labor and social mobility, the inability to leave one bad job and go to work elsewhere, or to try to mobilize, or to try to form a labor union to protect themselves?
We have another comment from Mr. George, Hudson George, saying there is no shortage of farm workers in Canada. Canadians refuse to work on farms because they can find better jobs to do and make more money. Saeed?
I mean, I think, Hudson also said previously about countries not being able to step out of the program. I just want to be clear about this. We are not calling for the closure of the program, right? Because workers want to come here, need to come here, and we want them to come here with full rights. And those rights come with citizenship. So what we're actually saying is people have the absolute same rights as every other citizen in the country. And they can choose to return or stay, but the choice should be given to people because, in Canada, all rights are mediated by your citizenship status, whether it's employment insurance, whether it's access to, in effect, citizenship is not about whether you live here or not. There are farm workers who've been coming to the country for 25, 30, 35 years. They've actually spent the majority of their lives. They've missed their kids' birthdays, weddings, funerals. They live here, in effect, right? So that's the main thing. We're not saying people should not come here. We're saying they should have full rights. I think separately, we need to, in each of our countries, do the organizing necessary that people aren't forced to go look for work elsewhere, right? Why can't we have economies where people can stay at home? I think, so I would really want to reiterate that. I think the other thing to say and to remember is that there is, there's a path to justice here that we can walk on, right? So this lawsuit all of the legal, but also all of the policy fights that are taking place. Repeatedly, the federal government in Canada has been pushed to accept over and over again that there's a fundamental power imbalance between workers and employers. I think that we can join together and make these changes, and we need everyone's support. If you're listening to us, if you know anyone in Canada who can be part of it, anyone in the Caribbean who can be part of it, take action.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have a viewer comment is asking, do you think that with that lawsuit, can it have serious implications from the Canadian government in terms of visa restrictions for the Caribbean? So that's another thing, right? Of course, there is a power differential. You talk about power differential. There is a global north, global south power differential here. And do you believe that perhaps that lawsuit can have implications in respect of how the farm worker program is treated with by the Canadian government and the agreements that they have with the Caribbean?
Louis, do you want to jump in, and then I could jump in after?
Yeah.
You go for it, Chris.
Okay. The lawsuit, this class action lawsuit, is for every worker from Thailand, from Mexico, from Guatemala, Honduras, the Philippines, Trinidad, the OACS, Mexico. So all workers are under this representation. So we believe that at this point in time, no. Right? There should be no restrictions. Our previous cases that we've taken on, we just also a little while ago had a huge racist, it's actually still going on, a racial profiling, a racist actions by the police. That's also now a class action lawsuit. As far as we know, that has not imperiled or denied anybody entry to Canada. And many years ago, the only reason why workers, and it gets a little complicated, but there was one benefit that under our EI system, they're called the special benefits that farm workers from the Caribbean were able to get. And that came out of organizing, it came out of outreach. And there was a lot of fear in the beginning where workers were, if we try to get this money, that, we might not be able to come back to Canada. That immediately fell through. Meaning that workers were able to come. Thousands of workers, when they were able to get full compensation and full support from our EI system, were able to come and go freely. So these are benefits that everybody should have access to. If there are consequences, which we don't see any, where all of us are going to raise hell.
And sorry, if
Yes,
I wasn't
Louis,
sure.
go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure I understood the question, but yeah, I think I do in terms of, reprisals or consequences for individuals who might participate. Yeah. I just add one point to what Chris already said, which is that is one of the advantages of a class action as a mechanism, right? Because there's two individuals who have courageously come forward to advance this case, but they've done it on behalf of all other migrant farm workers, right? So the class action system in Ontario is an opt-out system, meaning unless you actively opt out of the case, you're in the case, right? So it's when this class action gets certified, there's going to be a notification process, right? If it gets certified, I certainly expect it will, but there's going to be a notice process where we're going to ensure that as many migrant farm workers who are part of this class get notice of the class, and they will then have the opportunity to opt out of the class if they don't want to participate in it. But if they don't, then they're in the class and they will have the benefit of any judgment or settlement that we might reach. And the advantage of this vehicle and class actions generally is that you have a way to assert the rights of a large group of people who otherwise might be reticent to publicly assert their rights. And of course, there's no better, there's no more pressing, need for a class action than in the, precarious work and tied employment specifically, where the majority of these workers are going to, have all sorts of valid reasons why they might not want to bring forward a case, but they will be participants in this class action.
Gentlemen, thank you. We are going to come back for some closing comments, but certainly this has been a very important segment for the national community in Grenada, because when politicians in Grenada talk about this farm labor program, it's touted as providing employment benefits for the people, which is true. But on the other hand, they don't talk about the dark side of this program as well. So thank you for shedding light on this. Please stand by, folks. We'll take a quick break and be right back for the final segment of the Bub Report. Stand by.
listeners, I see Michael already smiling. He anticipates what I would say. My good friend.
Yeah, and I put my head on a block, and I offer Mr. Brother Bishop the scalpel to cut it off.
The political leader has said several times up to last night that that is not a reflection of her personal views or the views of the party. And you understand, George, how elections at the party level work.
So, Dr. Pei, do you have ties? Do you have ties to the National Democratic Congress, Dr. Pei? Or rather, were you commissioned by the NDC to do this poll?
Information because it seems interesting that a lot of your advice is very consistent with what was said. Brilliant.
And Claudette, good luck with everything.
You too, man. May the best candidate win in the town of St. George.
But kill on.
Yes.
You is a tongue man too, so stop it. Tell everybody you're a tongue man too.
We are a people who have always aspired for more. We've always aspired to do better. We've always accepted that not because your mother didn't go to secondary school, you should go. It has always been the other way around. You should aspire.
You've been there for a long time. Want to be queen of St. Andrews, but yet the problems around you you're not seeing. You can't pray yourself out of the problems in St. Andrews.
Some persons were getting pension after 2 terms in office, right? And the persons that work for 26 years plus not getting anything. It's just unfair.
God is good, and God looks after me. You know, not just my wife is no longer here, so both herself and the father up there are looking after me very, very well indeed.
Not a few people that you pick up by the side of the road to run an election, to run in an election. These are not people that you mustered up and you pulled together a few months before you think an election is going to call, and you say, we want to win an election, so let's come together.
And welcome back, viewers and listeners, to the final wrap-up for this week's edition of the Bub Report. And I want to begin with you, Mr. Century, closing comments.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Bubb, for the opportunity to share, what this case is about. I'd like to just reiterate that this case is really the culmination of years and years, really decades of struggle and advocacy that have been calling attention to these issues. We're doing the work of connecting some of these longstanding grievances to legal rights and constitutional rights so that we can finally have a day in court and have the government really call to account why it has imposed tied employment specifically on these workers all these years, and specifically accounting for what we say is the racist legacy of the decision to impose tied employment on a specific class of racialized workers, originally from the Caribbean and later from other countries in the global South, but not historically on European farm workers who really became Canadian citizens and whose grandchildren and great-grandchildren are citizens in this country now. So for all sorts of reasons, we're hopeful that this case will continue to call attention to these issues. And thank you so much for giving us this platform and opportunity to speak about it.
Absolutely. Chris?
I think for people in the diaspora as well as people in the Caribbean, it is imperative that they take this issue on and champion the cause of workers who've come up for years and years to work on Canadian farms. It's important that they amplify the voices of workers, and we address this inherent racism that exists in agriculture and the impediments to working class communities and the efforts by the Canadian state, particularly to deny workers the rights that they deserve. We're going to continue to work. We're going to continue to show solidarity with the farm workers from the Caribbean, the Mexico, and across the global South. And we encourage you to join us to ensure that these voices are not lost, particularly workers who are no longer in the program, and to ensure that we change. For the next 50 years, we have a system where dignity, respect, and fairness are enshrined for all workers, irrespective of status.
Absolutely. And Saeed?
I'll say two things. One is, I encourage everyone who is listening to go to statusforall.ca and sign a petition that sends an email to the Canadian government to ensure permanent resident status for all migrants in the countries. That's statusforall.ca. And any migrant farm worker or any relative or a friend of a migrant farm worker who wants to get in touch with us, get in touch over WhatsApp or text or call 905-324-2845. We want everyone who's listening to take action with us.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you so much for appearing on this week's edition of the Bub Report. As a programming note, we did invite to appear on the program because we are guided by balance here. We did invite the Deputy Labor Commissioner of Grenada, whose bailiwick is this particular migrant program, but her boss, who is the Labor Commissioner, Sparkle Grenade, Courtney, reached out to us indicating that they will no longer be interested in appearing on the program and speaking on this platform on this particular issue. So, gentlemen, thank you for appearing on the program this week. Viewers and listeners, this has been another installment of the Bub Report. We certainly thank you for viewing us this week, and we will see you next week for yet another installment of the Bub Report. On behalf of our producers who help us to produce this program every week, we thank them as well, and we thank you for tuning in this week as well. Thank you. Have a good week, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Bub Report's social media pages. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch our weekly live show, follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can catch repeat episodes on Wednesdays at 4 and 5 p.m. respectively on CRFM Radio and GBN TV in Grenada. We are also viewed on Sundays at 8 p.m. on WPG 10 throughout the Caribbean. Thanks for watching.